Hey, what's up? It's Riffy. Here to explain how diabetes can be somewhat explained through osmosis. So this was the diabetic emergency um, assistance I'm going to give you, and hopefully it helps you out. So we want to figure out, what does diabetes have to do with osmosis? One of the big experimental questions in this particular lab, which we use the dialysis tube and we place them in the different solutions, and you left them overnight, then you had to measure their mass afterwards. We want to try to figure out how we can anatomically and possibly physiologically explain Anna Garcia's symptoms of diabetes. And from the medical history document, you can probably remember that Anna Garcia experienced fatigue and a lack of energy. She had constant thirst, and she had frequent urination. Now, these things were symptoms prior to her actually being diagnosed with diabetes. So we're trying to explain how these symptoms pertain to diabetes using this lab. So we also need to know why she was experiencing these symptoms, and does it have to do with a type 1 diabetes diagnosis. Based on things we already know about diabetes, we know that diabetics have trouble regulating the concentration of glucose in their blood, because if they are a type 1 diabetic, they actually do not have the ability to produce an adequate amount of insulin. Or in a type 2 diabetic, they have malfunctioning or improper insulin, or the cells don't react to insulin in a correct manner. Because of this inability to produce insulin or the malfunctioning of insulin, their cells can't absorb glucose. This results in diabetics having a high glucose concentration in their blood. Okay. So in order to adequately understand this concept of the relationship between your blood, the glucose in the blood, and the cells and tissue within the body, you got to know a few things about blood. So your blood is actually made from two parts. You have the cells that are suspended in the blood. This tends to be red blood cells and white blood cells. And you also have the second portion of your blood, which is called the plasma or the serum. This is the watery substance that suspends your cells. It also has various other things in it: proteins, glucose, lipids. It's essentially the dissolving material, or the thing that suspends the cells. The cells of your blood tend to be red blood cells and white blood cells, like I said, and the serum or plasma is largely composed of water and other dissolved nutrients. Examples: glucose, proteins, like I mentioned earlier. And here's a nice diagram representing if you take your blood out of your body, put it in a test tube or a centrifuge, and spin it, all the red blood cells will form to the bottom and the plasma forms to the top, and the white blood cells are a small amount in between. So what you'll notice about this is most of your blood is in fact plasma or water and dissolved materials. Therefore, since it is a solution, you can measure the concentration of various materials inside of your blood. This is pertaining to diabetes because diabetics are typically concerned with the concentration of glucose in their blood, which is the amount of glucose molecules compared to the amount of water or plasma. The cells of the blood, like I said, are suspended or bathed in the plasma or serum. Your blood travels throughout your body and is exposed to all the different types of tissue, because your blood and your cardiovascular system is the transportation system for your body, carrying nutrients and other things. And we're going to concentrate on your blood carrying glucose within the serum. So, like we said earlier, the main contributor to diabetes is in fact glucose. Glucose is dissolved into the plasma or blood serum. When a diabetic consumes a high carb diet, it tends to increase the amount of glucose in the body, which thus increases the concentration of glucose. So let's rewind a little bit because I messed up. So say a diabetic eats a high carb diet. What happens then? They eat it, it gets into the digestive system. The small intestine removes glucose and puts it into the bloodstream. So here's our person. She's going to go ahead and eat her high carb diet. Yum, yum, yum. She eats it. The glucose moves into her bloodstream after being digested in the digestive system. And so now what you have is you have an increase in blood glucose concentration. In a normal non-diabetic, how this would be counteracted would be just like your insulin glucose cell model. The body would recognize that there's an increase in the concentration of glucose. It would tell the pancreas to release insulin. Insulin would bind with the cells, and the cells would take in that glucose. But in a diabetic, you know that insulin is non-functioning or non-existing. So what happens then, the diabetic still has to balance the concentration of glucose in the blood compared to the other tissue. The only way to do that is essentially by moving water to balance the concentration. So the water in the surrounding tissue outside of the blood then moves from outside of the blood to inside the blood. And as you notice, as water moves inside, the concentration of water gradually increases in the blood until the concentration of glucose inside is balanced with outside the cell. So, how does this pertain to osmosis? Well, concentration must be balanced in the blood compared to in the cells or tissue surrounding the blood. All of that is typically done through a method of diffusion or active transport or some kind of passive transport, but we're going to solely concentrate on diffusion here. Diffusion is the random movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to a low concentration. That difference in concentration usually exists inside cells compared to outside cells, or it could be a difference in the blood compared to in the tissue. The difference in concentration is called a concentration gradient. In simple diffusion, small molecules like gases have the ability to pass in and out of the cell freely, solely based on this concentration gradient. That means they don't require energy of any kind. Examples of things that can exhibit simple diffusion is water, oxygen, carbon dioxide. And like I said, this process does not require cellular energy. So here's what I want you to pretend. Here's our cell membrane here. Here's the area outside of the cell. Here's the area inside the cell. Over here at the beginning of this time frame, you will see that there's a ton of oxygen outside the cell and none inside the cell. So what actually happens is oxygen wants to balance through the concentration gradients, and like we said earlier, it likes to balance by going from a high concentration to a low concentration. So as time progresses, you will notice that some of the oxygen molecules start to diffuse across the cell membrane into the inside of the cell, till where eventually the number of oxygen molecules outside the cell is the same as it is inside the cell. With water, however, water gets its own special name. Osmosis is the diffusion of water across the cell membrane in order to balance the concentration of dissolved material inside the cell to outside the cell. Some molecules are large enough, such as glucose, that they lack the ability to move freely across the cell membrane. So in order to balance those concentrations, water is what actually passes in and out. In a non-diabetic, since glucose can't get through, it requires insulin to activate channels, which allows glucose to move into the cell. In a diabetic, again, lack insulin, so glucose cannot travel in and out of the cell, even because of the fact that they can't activate channels. So, since a type 1 diabetic lacks proper insulin, concentrations must be balanced through the use of water. So, how does this pertain to hyperglycemia? Hyperglycemia refers to a situation when a person has high blood sugar concentration. This causes the blood plasma or serum of the body to be a hypertonic solution. So that means the concentration of glucose in the blood is higher than that of the surrounding tissue. And that can be also called a hypertonic solution, meaning that, again, the concentration of glucose in this case is higher in the blood serum than it is in the surrounding tissue. What this can cause to happen, if you look at it from an individual cell basis, is water leaves the cells and actually ends up causing cells to shrink. So here's what I want you to pretend. Let's say that this is a type 1 diabetic, and this is this side over here represents the blood, and this side over here. So maybe I can label this. So this is blood and tissue. So again, we have our blood and we have our tissue here. What this creates, since the number of glucose molecules is the same in the tissue as it is in the blood, and the amount of water molecules in the tissue is the same as there is in the blood, this is what is considered to be an isotonic solution. There is a balance of concentration inside the cell as there is outside the cell. Let's assume that our type 1 diabetic consumes a high-carb diet, therefore resulting in an increase in the blood glucose concentration. So you notice as the digestive system breaks down those carbohydrates, the glucose molecules move into the bloodstream and increase the concentration of blood glucose in the blood. Remember, considering this side as the blood. And that creates a concentration gradient or a difference in the concentration of glucose in the blood than inside the tissue. In a normal non-diabetic patient, what you would get is insulin would come in, bind to the cell membranes on active sites, open channels, and glucose would move its way into the cell and balance the concentrations, and everything would be just fine. But since we have a type 1 diabetic, insulin is non-functioning, glucose can't move into the cell very easily, so what is going to happen is water itself is going to move across the cell membrane to balance the concentrations. So what you'll see happen is water molecules start moving from in the tissue over here to the surrounding blood plasma. And after that occurs, you will notice there is less water in the tissue and more water in the blood. This creates an interesting situation. So when you have diabetes, excess sugar in your blood builds up. The water moves, like we said back here, from in the tissue to the blood itself. Your kidneys are responsible for monitoring the amount of water in your blood. Well, when water moves from your tissues into your blood to balance that concentration of glucose, it causes your kidneys to start working overtime to filter not only the increase in water in your blood, but also the increase in concentration of glucose in your blood, that excess sugar. If your kidneys can't keep up with the filtering of sugar out of your blood, the excess sugar is then excreted out of your body in urine, along with any extra water that had been drawn from your tissue. This triggers more frequent urination. The production of urine also requires water. So this is not only drawing water out of your tissues, but it's also causing your kidneys to use more water to actually create urine. The more water usage leaves a type 1 diabetic dehydrated. So if their cells or their tissue are dehydrated, it triggers the thirst sensation. If you're thirsty, you drink more water. If you drink more water, it causes you to have to produce more urine. So what ends up happening is this crazy vicious cycle. The question becomes, if a diabetic notices they are hyperglycemic, what should they do? Keep in mind, type 1 diabetics do not produce enough insulin to adequately balance the concentration of glucose inside tissue compared to the blood. So what do they do, or what kind of action can they take to solve this problem? What they do, the solution is for a type 1 diabetic or a diabetic to actually increase the amount of insulin in their blood. Therefore, they take an insulin shot or they use an insulin pump, which puts insulin into their body, which allows it to bind to the cells, which opens the channels, which allows glucose to enter, and you don't end up with this movement of water and this increase of water in the blood, which increases the amount of urine production, which then increases the frequency of urination, which then causes you to be thirsty, and you drink more water, and it causes you to go to the bathroom more, and it continues over and over and over and over and over again. Now, a hypotonic solution is the solution in which the concentration of dissolved material is lower in the surrounding area of the cells or tissue than it is inside. In this situation, this would mean that it's a hypoglycemic situation. It's where there's a higher concentration of glucose in the cells and a low concentration in the blood, but it also could mean that there is too much insulin in the blood. In order to solve this situation, a hypoglycemic situation is to increase the amount of blood sugar by eating or drinking a substance that is higher in sugar. So this can occur when a diabetic accidentally gives themselves too much insulin or too large of a shot of insulin, and they notice certain symptoms, which you can probably pull from the Anna Garcia scenarios, and they balance that out by sometimes drinking juice, which is high in things like fructose, or if it's Kool-Aid, it's just flat out sugar. And that sugar is absorbed in their bloodstream and balances that concentration. The best way for a diabetic to control this situation is to constantly monitor or test their blood sugar levels and adequately adjust accordingly. Man, well, I hope this helps you out with the explanations in your lab and helps you draw the conclusions necessary. If you have any questions, send me an email. Thanks.